Okay, so last week we had a whole discussion about when to make Aliyah, and it was a really great discussion, and we really outlined, I think, a good perspective on defining the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz, of settling the land of Israel, and when that obligation would fall on the individual to finally make that move. To go to Eretz Yisrael, and we came to the conclusion that it's dependent upon whether or not someone would be a contributing member of society in Eretz Yisrael. If a person is better suited not yet making that move because they are not yet finished with the work they're doing outside of Israel, either for their personal growth or financial growth or whatever it might be, and they are not yet comfortable that they're going to be able to contribute in the same manner in Eretz Yisrael, or close to the same manner in Eretz Yisrael. So then one would not, and that's what the Avnei says, one would not yet have the obligation to go. But nevertheless, if a person is, of course, able to, so then it's a great mitzvah to go and live in Eretz Yisrael. And we said that this is really the approach of almost all of the Rishonim, almost all of our great poskim, that of course there is a mitzvah that applies in its full in full force, the mitzvah to live in Israel today. But we brought down from the Ramban Nachmanides last week that there are two mitzvot related to settling the land of Israel. There's the individual mitzvah, the mitzvah for me, personally for me, of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of me moving to Israel. But then there's a mitzvah that falls upon all of Klal Yisrael, and that's the mitzvah of kibush haaretz, of conquering or in mass settling the land of Israel, making sure there's Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel is a obligation from the Torah that the Jewish people are supposed to have sovereignty in the land of Israel. There is an amazing Gemara in Masechta Gittin that writes the following. Gemara says in Masechta Gittin on Daf Ches that let's say it's whatever the scenario might be, it's a Shabbos is the way that the Gemara frames it, Shabbos. And on Shabbos, there is an opportunity for you to be able to purchase land in the land of Israel. Now, we know we don't do business on Shabbos. We don't do any transactions on Shabbos. But if I don't do it now, I'm going to lose the opportunity. So what's one supposed to do? This is the riddle that's posed by the Gemara. What's one supposed to do? So the Gemara says simply, you are able to go ahead with the purchase as long as you have a non-Jew help you do the aspects of the purchase that would violate Torah, Shabbos, that would violate the laws pertaining to Shabbos. We know we're not allowed to do business on Shabbos, so I could have a non-Jew do the business on my behalf. He could act as an agent for me to help secure the land on my behalf. Now, this is a general concept that we have in Hilchos Shabbos called Amira La'akum, where I can ask someone who's not Jewish, if I ask someone who's not Jewish to do work for me, it drops down whatever it is that I was going to do down to a rabbinic prohibition. But there's still a rabbinic prohibition of asking a non-Jew to do work for me on Shabbos. Yes, Steve?
Business transactions are rabbinic?
Yeah, so business transactions, exactly right. So Steve is saying exactly Tosfos' explanation of the Gemara. The Tosfos says, being that business transaction is only a rabbinic prohibition as it is, right? So then asking a non-Jew to do work for me in that way, to violate a rabbinic law on my behalf, it's okay for the sake of a mitzvah. It's called, this is a concept in Hilchos Shabbos called shvus d'shvus b'makom mitzvah, that a rabbinic prohibition can be done by a non-Jew on Shabbos if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, for the sake of a mitzvah. So that's a good example of that. No, you can ask directly. So for example, so without getting into all the details, but that's a great example, Nora, is that let's say I have a light on in my refrigerator turning the light off in the refrigerator is only rabbinic prohibition. Asking a non-Jew to do it is a rabbinic prohibition. That's a double derabanan. It's a shvus to shvus. Asking a non-Jew to do a rabbinic prohibition for the sake of a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? That I need to be able to eat on Shabbos. I can't open my refrigerator because the light's on, right? Every time I open it, the light's going to turn on. Every time I close it, the light's going to turn off. So I could ask a non-Jew to unscrew the light bulb on my behalf. Again, it's a double derabanan for the sake of a mitzvah. That's Tosafos' perspective on the Gemara. The Ramban, though, Nachmanides, which is so appropriate because the Ramban really became famous in one of the things he became famous in was his perspective about Eretz Yisrael, where I'm sure all of the Rishonim, all the great tzaddikim, are part of being a great person in Klal Yisrael is that you have an ahavas Eretz Yisrael. You have a love for the land of Israel. It's like Rav Kook. They asked him how he became so enthralled with Israel, or why did he become so crazy about Zionism? So he said, "What do you mean? I read the Bible. I read Tanakh. That's it. If you read Tanakh, you become in love with Eretz Yisrael. It's impossible for someone to not end up with that kind of a perspective." But chief among them was the Ramban. I mean, the amount of times, almost every 10 pages of the Ramban's commentary on the Torah, he talks about Eretz Yisrael. I mean, it's like a constant theme that's coming up over and over and over again about the Ramban. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, was one of the greatest, probably the greatest Jewish philosopher to ever live. He, at least in the post-Talmudic era, the Ramban, he has his commentary on the Chumash that we had discussed last week, where he tells us there's a mitzvah of both Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of settling the land of Israel, and also Kibush Haaretz, of having Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And he also has his commentary on the Rambam, on the Rambam Maimonides' book of the mitzvos, the Ramban Nachmanides, who was 9 years old when the Rambam died. The Ramban lived 1194 to 1270. So he has that book, but one of the chief works of the Ramban of Nachmanides is his book on the Talmud. Okay, this is a copy of his book on the Talmud, the Chidushei Ramban, the novel concepts from the Ramban and his explanations of the Talmud. So he has a comment on that Gemara in Masechta Gittin. Remember, the Gemara told me, the Talmud told me that if I have a plot of land in Israel that I'm able to secure, but it's Shabbos, so what am I supposed to do? So I can ask a non-Jew to secure on my behalf. Tosafos said, as Steve pointed out, Tosafos says that this is only asking him to violate rabbinic law on my behalf. For a non-Jew to violate rabbinic law on my behalf, it's okay because it's for the sake of a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? Settling the land of Israel, right? Says the Ramban, no. I could even ask the non-Jew to violate Torah prohibitions on my behalf, to violate even the Shabbos prohibitions that are of a Torah nature, a higher level of prohibition. I could ask the non-Jew to violate on my behalf for the sake of settling the land of Israel. Why? I thought that it's only rabbinic law that such a dispensation exists, right? That's what the Tosafos said, that only for the sake of rabbinic law, I could ask a non-Jew to do, because that's the concept of shvus dishvus, a double derabanan for the sake of a mitzvah. To ask a non-Jew to violate Torah law on my behalf, why would we say such a thing? Why would that be okay? In this scenario, says the Ramban, because this is not just any mitzvah. The language he uses is, it's a mitzvah derabim. It's a mitzvah that affects all of Klal Yisrael. Me buying land in Israel, says the Ramban, is a mitzvah that's derabim, that affects all of Klal Yisrael. And a mitzvah that affects all of Klal Yisrael, I'm allowed to ask a non-Jew to even violate Torah law on my behalf because it's so important. It's so important, it breaks all the rules. That in and of itself is an amazing concept. But what comes out from this Ramban is that when one person makes Aliyah, what you are essentially doing is, number one, you're fulfilling your personal mitzvah of settling the land of Israel, but you are also helping the Jewish people as a whole fulfill their national obligation of having Jewish sovereignty in the land. It's when one moves to Israel, they are helping the Jewish people fulfill that mitzvah of not just Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, not just settling land, but Kibush Haaretz, of conquering and having Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Just when one person moves there, So what comes out from that is that it would mean, it just sounds like it is so blatantly obvious that there is a mitzvah that applies even today, as the Ramban's making very, very clear, of this mitzvah of not just making Aliyah for me personally, but ensuring that there's Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And as we mentioned in the past, that what that means, like Rav Shechter quotes from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that you have making sure there's a Jewish government in the land, which Baruch Hashem there is, and that there's an army, which thank God a million times there's Sahal, and that these are things that are necessary in order to bring forth Mashiach, God willing. That's what the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us on Daf Chaf. The problem, though, is that, and this is what a lot of the anti-Zionist opinions is based on, the following Gemara Masechta Ksubas. Okay, and we're going to have to deal with how we can justify this Gemara, how we could rationalize this Gemara, because basically what the Gemara tells us in Ksubas Daf Kuf Yud Aleph is the following. The Gemara tells us that there was some sort of a deal that was made between God, the Jewish people, and the other nations of the world. It's called the Shalosh Shvuos, the Gimel Shvuos, and it's hinted to in Shir Hashirim, because it says in Shir Hashirim the word Hishbati 3 times, that I've taken an oath with. There was some sort of a deal that was made between God, the Jewish people, and the rest of the nations. What was the deal? The deal was, number 1, Lo Ya'alu Bechoma, that the Jewish people, after they go into exile, are not going to reconquer the land of Israel by force. We're not going to forcibly take back the land of Israel. Number 2 is that the other nations of the world are not going, the number 2 and 3 are very similar, are not going to enslave us or cause us unnecessary harm. They're going to, the other nations of the world cannot torture the Jewish people, cannot enslave the Jewish people, cannot do hard labor for the Jewish people. So based on that Gemara, that the Jewish people committed to basically waiting until Mashiach comes. That's what the basic understanding of that Gemara. The Jewish people waited to say that we're going to wait until Mashiach comes, until we regain sovereignty over the land of Israel. So how can we then rationalize a religious Zionist perspective, while at the same time the Talmud is telling us that we made a deal to not resettle the land of Israel in that national kind of way, and to not recreate sovereignty in the land of Israel by force. So how could we rationalize such a thing? So I want to suggest 4 basic ways of dealing with this Gemara. Number 1 is based off of the Yerushalmi in which, by the way, I should mention that based off of that Gemara that says that the Jewish people have committed to not reconquering and regaining sovereignty over the land, that is the source material for the Satmar Rebbe in his Sefer Vayol Moshe, which I have a copy at home. The Sefer Minchas Alozar from the Munkat Rebbe also uses the same raya. The Sefer Megillas Esther, which is a commentary on the Rambam, written by Rabbeinu Isaac de Leon, who is a Spanish commentator who died 4 years before the Spanish Inquisition. So there are these major rabbinic scholars that are using this Gemara and saying, listen, we're just following what it says in the Talmud. It's not an emotional issue. This is a halachic issue. So what would be our response? Number 1 would say the following. There's a Yerushalmi in Masechta Peah. There's a Yerushalmi in Masechta Peah that says, Ein lemedin halacha min ha'agada, that one is not allowed to arrive at a halachic conclusion based off of the agada that's contained in the Talmud. What's an agada? The agadados are the stories that are contained in the Gemara or ethical teachings that are contained in the Gemara, not the Gemara that is dealing with hardline halacha, dry Jewish law, but rather the more philosophical types of Gemaras. Gemaras that are framed in a story, things like that. That, says the Yerushalmi, you can't come to the bottom line halacha based off of Agata. It's a Yerushalmi in Masechta Peah. So this Gemara, I think according to most, it probably would fall more under the category of Agatata than it would halacha. How do I know that? Because this Gemara is not codified by any Jewish codes. It's not codified by the Rambam. It's not codified by the Shulchan Aruch. So if it was a halacha, if it was giving us a directive that there is a prohibition, we are not allowed to reconquer the land of Israel, it should say that in Shulchan Aruch. It should say it in the Rambam. Right, exactly. Like it's clearly much more agadic in nature than it is halachic in nature. So therefore, that's number one, is that you can't hang your hat in the halacha and say, we have to be concerned for this Gemara that we made an oath that we're not. No, I mean, the Gemara is clearly talking about it's talking about something. What the parameters of that oath, quote unquote, was or is less of a concern for us when we're talking about the straight mitzvah of, is there still a mitzvah to conquer the land of Israel? And the answer is yes. I mean, that Gemara that we said in Masechta Gittin, of that you can on some level violate Shabbos, depending on the scenarios, right? Like we said about using a non-Jew, for example, in order to settle the land, it clearly is not assuming like that Gemara, and that is quoted in Shulchan Aruch. So that's number one. Number two is the following, and this is what Steve was alluding to also, is that the Maharal was probably number two on the list in terms of post-Talmudic Jewish philosophers. Right after the Ramban probably came the Maharal. The Maharal, who was the chief rabbi in Prague. So he says that this Gemara can't be taken literally. Can't be taken literally. When we say Shavua, that there was an oath that was made, I mean, who made the oath? Right? Well, there's no historical account of this oath. There is an oath or a deal that is alluded to in Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs of Shlomo Melech. But I mean, who made the deal, right? Was it Moshe? Was it Yehoshua? Was it Shlomo HaMelech himself? Was it Yirmiyahu? Was it? I mean, who made this oath? So the Maharal says what shvua sometimes in that context could mean is that it's not like a real shvua, but rather it's just highlighting what the will of God is. Meaning the will of God after the Jewish people went into exile was to be patient. Don't just right away run back and try and reconquer the land of Israel. Be patient. Be patient. I'm going to try and make a deal with the other nations to make sure that you don't become overly burdened, and there's not going to be too much anti-Semitism, and you be a little bit patient in terms of coming back. Now, that can change over time, right? You just have to look at the writing on the wall, and it's blatantly obvious that has changed over time, right? Probably one of the more obvious changes that took place was the Balfour Declaration, for example, right? Like and that's just one example of many examples of that. All you have to do is look at the writing on the wall to know that we were now ready to resettle and regain our sovereignty over the land of Israel.
Who's making this oath? Supposed to be?
Exactly. That's the Maharal's point, is that there was nobody doing it. It's just highlighting what the will of God was when the Jewish people entered into exile, was to
Directed at the nations or
both. So and the Maharal gives another example. Another example of this is the word bris, which is very similar to Shvuah. The word bris is a covenant that the Torah tells us in Parshas Vayikra that on every single carbon, every single offering that's put on the Mizbeach, Bamelach Timlach, and you need to put salt on the carbon. Says the Torah, why? Because if one does not, they're going to violate bris melach elokecha. You're going to violate the covenant, the salt covenant with God. What's a salt covenant? Did Avraham make a salt covenant? He had a bris milah and a bris bein habasarim. Who made a salt covenant? So again, the Maharal is saying that's a classic example of the word bris or shvua. This is just representing what the will of God is. That's what it's representing. So at that point in history, the Jewish people needed to be a little bit patient until there was an opening once again for us to come and resettle the land and regain sovereignty over the land. Now we Baruch Hashem, with the opportunity has presented itself, and thank God we are fulfilling the will of God that is today. And really that shvua, quote unquote, that oath, that deal, that at once upon a time representation of the will of God no longer applies anymore today. So that's the Maharal's approach. Number 3, the third way of countering this Gemara comes from the Or Sameach. Who is the Or Sameach? Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, who was an unbelievable Torah scholar. He was a late 19th century rabbinic scholar. He was very, very close with the Rogachover Gaon, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, who was not. I don't want to speak, God forbid, lashon hara about. I'm sure he was a tzaddik and he was a massive Talmud Chacham, but the Rogachover was not known for, we'll call it, his bedside manner. He was not known for being the easiest person to get along with. And the Rogachover's best friend was Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk was able to gain the respect of anybody, even the Rogachover. In fact, the Rogachover referred to him. Rav Meir Simcha was a Kohen, referred to him as the Kohen Gadol. He was the Kohen Gadol of Dvinsk. He was a massive Talmud Chacham. It's an understatement in terms of being a massive Talmud Chacham. He was one of the star pupils of the Beis Halevi, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik's father. An incredible personality. In fact, he wrote 2 books in his life. In his lifetime. There's since been more published posthumously, but 2 books that he wrote. One, the first book he wrote was the Meshech Chachma, which is his work on his commentary on the Torah, his commentary on the Chumash, which was written masterfully, where he was able to take Kabbalistic ideas and explain them in layman terms in order to help gain better appreciation for traditional rabbinic literature. It took someone who really had a master in both the mystical aspects of Judaism and also the more concrete aspects of Judaism to be able to present all of it in such a concise and clear kind of way. He was really a master in that. And the second book he wrote was the Or Sameach, but he published the Or Sameach first. Why did he publish the Or Sameach first? Because after he wrote the Meshech Chachma, someone said to him that, this is at least the legend, someone said to him that, if you right away publish a book, which is essentially a book on Jewish thought, right? It's a commentary on the Chumash. If you publish a work like that first, no one's going to take your Or Sameach seriously. What's the Or Sameach? It's a book on analyses of the Talmud in light of the Rambam's rulings. It's a heavy work that's studied in yeshivas. It's a book of Talmudic analysis, halacha. And if you want people to take that seriously, don't start with a book that is basically a book of Jewish philosophy or Jewish thought. Better that you start with a heavy hitter type of a book like your Or Sameach, and then you publish your Meshech Chachma. So he said, okay, fine. So he published his Or Sameach, and then he was ready to go ahead and publish the Meshech Chachma, and he passed away. And they had to publish it posthumously, the Meshech Chachma. So he never had the opportunity to actually publish it himself. He was really amazing. The Or Sameach his Divrei Torah is accessible to everybody. So the Or Sameach in 1917 said that the deal broke. These oaths, even if they are real oaths, they broke. The deal broke. How do I know that the deal broke? Because the other nations of the world that we are holding ourselves accountable to, that we are not going to retake the land of Israel. Well, Lord Arthur Balfour in November of 1917 said that the Jewish people should have sovereignty over the land of Israel, essentially because they were the controllers of the land of Israel, was essentially saying that the deal is broken. You no longer have to hold up your end of the deal. That's the Or Sameach said. Imam said that. And therefore, even if this was a real deal that the Jewish people had made with the other nations of the world, and we are being held accountable to make sure that we don't overtake the land of Israel, against their will. Well, it's not against their will. Once the Balfour Declaration was sent over to Lord Rothschild, so then that's it. The deal was broken at that point, and we were essentially given permission to come back and retake the land of Israel at that point. And then, of course, of course, 1947, and then later 1948, obviously just amplified his opinion. But his opinion, he felt, was strong even starting from 1917, after the Balfour Declaration was signed. So then, or made. So then the non-Jewish nations were essentially saying that you're welcome to reclaim the land of Israel at that point. So we're not violating any part of our oath. So that's number 3. And number four is the Or Sameach continues, and he says that even if that wasn't the case, the other nations already broke their end of the deal. Remember, we said, and Stuart pointed this out, that there's two sides over here, right? The Jewish people are saying we're not going to reclaim the land by force. And what are the other nations? What did they commit to? To not enslave and not have anti-Semitism, no genocides. No. So what about the Chmielnicki riots? And what about all the Crusades? And what about the Black Death Massacre? And what about, all of Jewish history? What about even after the Or Sameach? What about the Holocaust? They didn't hold up their end of the deal. So as soon as that happened, okay, so we don't have to hold up our end of the deal either, right? So these are four perspectives on why it is that this Gemara perhaps does not have an effect on the halachic implications of the Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel. Again, number one is that we don't make halacha based off of agadata, and this is clearly an agadata. Number two is that this was not a real shvuah, the Maharal said. Right? This is just trying to reflect what the will of God was at that point in history, but not necessarily after that point. Number three, the Or Sameach is saying that they forgave their end of the deal with the Balfour Declaration. And number four is that they didn't hold up their end of the deal, says the Or Sameach, because of all of the pogroms and the Crusades and the massacres, Rahman al-Islam, and the genocides and the Holocaust. So
I thought the deal was that we couldn't resettle it until the nation stopped enslaving.
No. Let me read the Gemara inside. Let me read it inside. I think it will make it a little clearer. Let me just pull it up over here.
Because it seems like the Orthodox is sort of contradicting itself with
Here.
contradicting 3.
Yeah, so let me read you the Gemara. I'll make it a lot clearer. Here we go. The Gemara says the following. Gimel Shvalos Halolu Lama. What are these 3 oaths? Achas, number 1, Shelo Yalu Yisrael Bechoma, that the Jewish people would not go up to Israel in force, en masse, right? We would not regain sovereignty over the land of Israel. Number 2, V'achas Sheheshbiah HaKadosh Baruch Hu Es Yisrael that God made the Jewish people swear not to rebel against the other nations of the world. And number 3 is that God made the other nations swear not to persecute the Jewish people more than necessary, that not to overly burden the Jewish people. So there were 2 sides of the deal, that they're the Jewish people, that we are not going to forcibly take back the land of Israel, and that the other nations are committing to not enslave the Jewish people. Well, they didn't hold up their end of the deal, so we don't have to hold up our end of the deal.
You really have to look at it, I mean, it has its own internal logic, because theoretically, if the Jews weren't persecuted, they wouldn't need to resettle the land. And if they were persecuted in Europe, where else do they have to go? It has its own internal logic.
Well, that would make them dependent upon each other then.
Well, yeah, what I'm saying is that it's, I guess you could look at it as an oath, but it doesn't need to be an oath. It's a statement of perfect logic.
Oh, yeah.
So
Right. So even if you're not going to take it in as a full oath, but regardless, it is highlighting the fact that, well, we are not going to need to come back to the land of Israel if you guys hold up your end of the deal, right? But if you don't, so then we're forced to go back to the land of Israel. Yeah, they get in. Very good. I was waiting for somebody to ask me. So these are 4 very strong. This is a very strong rebuttal, right? So what's their response? So their response, and again, like we always speak about during this time period, we're right now sitting in Sphira, right, where we are mourning the death of the students of Rabbi Kiva over the fact that they did not have respect for one another, and the Maharsha says what it means. They didn't have respect for each other's halachic opinions. So my Rabbi of David Hirschlita says that he thinks that it's hashkacha. It's really divine intervention, that the days that have led to so much controversy in halachic controversy in among the Jewish people, Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, fall out during Sphira, because perhaps this is Hashem testing us to see whether or not we're going to respect each other's opinions. So what we presented till now is obviously what our opinion is, right? This is obviously how we paskin. This is, or what our Masorah from Rav Shechter Shlita and all of our. This is not only the religious Zionist perspective. This is even the yeshivish or more Haredi perspective. There are some opinions that follow the Satmar Rebbe and the Minchas Elazar. Now, what is going to be their response? So the response is that that could all be well and good, except for the fact that the Jewish people are still suffering in Gullus. They feel, and this is what the Satmar Rebbe writes this, and the Minchas Elazar also, they feel that us as a Jewish nation suffering in Gullus is indicative of the fact that we are still experiencing some sort of onesh min hashamayim, some sort of a divine punishment, some sort of for whatever the reason is that we are being punished. I don't know, but I'm sure that they discussed that. But some sort of a divine punishment that we are experiencing, and that it's not that the oaths just fell away, but rather it's that any suffering we are experiencing in Gullus is for a reason, and that the Jewish people are supposed to be experiencing that kapara, that atonement, in order so that we could have Mashiach come sooner. Meaning, by us trying to go to Israel sooner, perhaps can slow down Mashiach's arrival, because we are not experiencing the full atonement that we would otherwise. That's their perspective. Now, we wouldn't agree to that, and I'll give you the rebuttal back to that in just a second. But that's their opinion. Now, what is the response to that? So Rav Shechter thinks that the response to that is that is not our perspective in general. When one is experiencing a difficulty, we don't just sit idly by and take it. What's a perfect example of that? Someone's sick. What do? They don't say that this illness that I have is a kapara, It's an atonement for any sins that I'll have, and therefore I'm not going to go see a doctor. No, that's not our approach. The Torah says, "V'rapo yirapeh." We give permission to medical professionals to provide medicine, right? So the Gemara in Bava Kama on Daf Mem Hey says that the Gemara says that if someone's sick, what are you supposed to do? You go to the doctor. They say you don't need a proof text from the Torah to tell me I need to go to the doctor. You go to the doctor, right? It's just basic logic. You go to right. You don't say that I'm going to take this atonement, right? That's not it, right? That's not a. So Eretz Yisrael, the state of Israel, is Klal Yisrael's medication. We need to go and take advantage of it, right? We don't say that no, it's going to slow down. No, where we have to take the atonement. No, of course not. We should go and not take it. We should go and go to Eretz Yisrael in order so that we do not have to deal with the onesh. That was Rav Shechter's response. I just want to close with a thought from the Chavetz Chaim that Eretz Yisrael is something that we have this inherent love for, this natural love for Eretz Yisrael. I mean, like Rav Shechter says that he's never met somebody who went to Eretz Yisrael and toured around and looked around and didn't on some level fall in love with it. I mean, it strikes a chord in a Jewish heart, the land of Israel. In fact, Yaakov Moshe Charlap Zatzal was one of the closest students of Rav Kook. He says that, when a Jew looks at Eretz Yisrael, it's different than looking at other geography. It looks different. It's like the difference between looking at a Sefer Torah versus looking at another book. Right? It's different looking. You could see the holiness. You could see the kedusha. So the Chavetz Chaim points to in benching is there's a line in benching that highlights this tremendously. We say in benching, the second paragraph of benching, we thank God for the land of Israel. Right? We thank God for the land, and we refer to the land of Israel as Eretz Chemda. It's the land that is Chemda, Tova Ruchava. It is bountiful. Tova, it is good, and Rechava, and it's vast. It says Chavetz Chaim, Eretz Yisrael is vast. Eretz Yisrael is tiny, right? Eretz Yisrael is minuscule. It's minuscule. It's like San Diego County is a little bit smaller than Eretz Yisrael, right? Like Eretz Yisrael is tiny. Why are we calling it Rechava? Why are we calling it vast? It's not vast. Look on a globe. It's not vast at all. Brazil is vast. Eretz Yisrael is not vast. So the Chavetz Chaim says, yes, that question is a good question if you are measuring Eretz Yisrael on a geographic scale. If you're measuring Eretz Yisrael on a geographic scale, so yes, it is. It's not vast, but that's not the scale to measure Eretz Yisrael on. You're supposed to measure Eretz Yisrael on a GMA scale, on a scale of diamonds. That's really what Eretz Yisrael is. Eretz Yisrael is not just another landmass. Eretz Yisrael is a diamond. It's the largest diamond in the world. It is Rechava. It's the largest diamond in the world. So, with this in mind, we need to make sure that we encourage one another as much as we can to support, to continue to visit. We'll give a plug for the Why Not, Brian? We'll give a plug for the Federation trip. When is it? So exactly a year away. The Community 2023 trip to Israel. Yeah. Yeah, you can join me and Brian. You can join me and Brian. We're going to, God willing, we'll have a bus.
We should have many representatives of our school join the Federation.
That's right. Why not? You go to Eretz Yisrael and you get to experience the Eretz Chemda Torah Chava. But I'll implore that you take advantage even sooner. Don't wait for another year to go. We go and we get to experience the Rechava. We get to experience the greatest diamond in the world, the most precious jewel that Klal Yisrael has. By the way, you ever notice the first conversation that God has with each of the avos? What's the main topic of conversation? Eretz Yisrael. The main topic of conversation with each of the avos And the first conversation that God has with them is Eretz Yisrael. When God tells Avram Avinu, Lechacha ma'artzecha, he tells him to go. Where does he tell him to go? It's not clear in the pasuk. Right? Later, we know he tells him that he's going to Eretz Canaan, that he's going to the land of Israel. But he doesn't tell him right away. Why isn't it clear where he's going right away? So the Ibn Ezra says, of course, he told him where he was going. Rashi says no. Rashi says he didn't tell him where he was going. Why not? So the Kedusha Slavi, Reb Levi Berditchev, and Rabbi Soloveitchik happened to give I don't know if he knew that Reb Levi Yitzchak said the same idea, but they both gave the same explanation. You know why he didn't tell him where he was going? Part of the test of Avram Avinu was not just whether or not he was going to get up and go, whether or not Avram Avinu had the spark in his neshama to be able to gravitate towards the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Get up and go. I want to see where you end up. And Avram Avinu ended up in Eretz Yisrael. He gravitated toward the Kedusha of the land because it emanates this Kedusha. So Hashem wanted to see whether or not Avram was so in tune with Kedusha, with holiness, with godliness, that he was going to be able to find that land, that he was going to gravitate towards that land. We all are gravitated. We all have this magnetic force that's pulling us towards Eretz Yisrael. Everybody in the right time, be'ito, bismano, b'shatov, mitzlachas. Everyone should go in the right time. God willing, we should all be able to make Aliyah and be able to help fulfill the mitzvah derabim, the communal mitzvah, as the Ramban said, of by me going and settling the land of Israel. So then we're helping Klal Yisrael fulfill the national mitzvah of gaining sovereignty over the land. Yeah, Marty, and then we'll stop here.
How many mitzvot are there?